Hi, this is Lindsay Linzer from the Miami Foundation. We're going to get started in just a minute. Thanks. All right, good morning. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's webinar to learn more about the Miami-Dade Nonprofit Support Grants Program. My name is Lindsay Linzer and I'm here with Julissa Rivera from the Miami Foundation. Some quick housekeeping before we dive into the presentation. Please use the questions inbox to submit your questions throughout today's presentation. We're going to have ample time at the end for Q&A. As part of this presentation, it is best that you ask us general questions about the program and about the application process. If you have really specific questions that are related to your organization, it's best if you contact us via the support inbox or by scheduling one-on-one office hours. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Julissa to share some important details with the members of our audience where English is not your first language. Today's presentation will be primarily in English, but if you need help related to this program in Spanish or any other language, we are here to help you out. Julissa?
Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. Buenos días a todos. Y como mencionó Lindsay, la presentación de hoy será en inglés, pero si alguien necesita ayuda en relación a este programa en español o cualquier otro idioma, estamos aquí para ayudarles. En la pantalla podrán ver enlaces relacionados con este programa. El equipo de Miami Foundation está disponible para brindarles apoyo, ya sea por correo electrónico o por teléfono en las horas designadas de oficina. De necesitar alguna sección de estos materiales de información que vamos a presentar hoy en algún otro idioma o necesita que se le explique cualquier duda, envíe un correo electrónico a support@miamifoundation.org y le ayudaremos con mucho gusto.
Thank you, Julissa. So we're here today to share all of the important details about a new $10 million grant program for nonprofits serving Miami-Dade County. 6 months have passed since the COVID-19 pandemic took over our community, and we know that nonprofits have been on the front lines of this crisis, serving the food, health, educational, and housing needs of our community. And unfortunately, nonprofits were not spared the devastating impacts of this crisis. We know that more than 30% of our local organizations had to lay off staff, and almost all organizations are expecting revenue losses this year and next. All the while, costs are increasing to provide services, and it's estimated that 60% of organizations have not received any sort of assistance to help them get through this challenging time. Here at the Miami Foundation, we've seen an incredible outpouring of generosity and care from the community to date. And in partnership with our fund holders and our generous donors, we've been able to move more than $3 million into nonprofit organizations on the front lines. But we know that that amount pales in comparison to the true need in our community. And that is why we are so excited to be here today to tell you about the Miami-Dade Nonprofit Support Grant Program. The Miami Foundation, in partnership with Miami-Dade County through its Department of Public Housing and Community Development, is offering one-time grants to nonprofits to help provide relief to organizations that were impacted by COVID-19. This $10 million in funding is made possible through federal CARES Act funds and must be used to cover employee payroll, business interruption costs, and other reopening expenses related to COVID-19. The source of this funding is really important for you to understand. A lot of the rules that you'll see in the guidelines and the restrictions in the applications were not up to the Miami Foundation, and they were not up to Miami-Dade County. These are federal rules that were put in place by Congress when they approved these funds. The Miami-Dade County Board of Commissioners know how hard the nonprofit sector has been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis and has approved $10 million to be allocated to support the smallest and hardest hit organizations in our community. Julissa is now going to walk us through who is eligible and who is not eligible to apply to the program. Julissa?
Oh, okay. So as you see on the screen and in the program guidelines, there is very clear criteria about who is and who is not eligible. These items are not negotiable. And all participants will be screened at the very beginning of the application process to confirm the eligibility criteria. We know all types of entities have been hurt by this crisis and have been hurt by this crisis, but this pool of funding is designated for 501c3 organizations or equivalents, which will include churches. That means no businesses and no individuals can apply. Churches, however, can only apply to receive funds for non-inherently religious programs, services, or activities. Organizations must be legally incorporated in Florida and must be based in and providing services in Miami-Dade. New nonprofits which opened their doors this year amidst the crisis are not eligible to apply. Eligible organizations had to have been providing services since before January 1st, 2019. This pool of funds is also designated to support small organizations defined as organizations with 25 or fewer employees as of March 1st, 2020. Additionally, funds are intended to help organizations which have had financial losses as a result of COVID-19 and those organizations that continue to provide services. Various points within the applications will probe to help us know this information. Now let's go to priority criteria. In addition to the eligibility criteria, there is also priority criteria. Organizations meeting all the eligibility criteria plus other priority criteria will be evaluated for and receive grant funds first. If your organization had gross revenues of $3 million or less in calendar year 2019, you will be given priority. If your organization has not yet received financial support through the other government grants or loan programs, you will be given priority. Since initially launching the program, we have made significant changes to the guidelines. Arts and cultural institutions are now eligible to apply. But it is critically important to know while they could apply, if they receive funding through the Department of Cultural Affairs Miami-Dade Artist Support Grant Program, they will not be considered priority. This is important, so please take note of it. Even if your organization does not meet the priority criteria, but you do meet eligibility criteria, please apply. While we are giving special attention to smaller organizations who have not received assistance, it is anticipated there will be significant funds still available to support organizations who are eligible but do not meet the priority criteria. Ineligible applicants. We want to also make clear which types of organizations are not eligible to apply for this program. Schools, daycares, preschools are not eligible to apply. A separate bucket of funds are being made available to them. School support organizations like Parent-Teacher Association, Booster Club, or any auxiliary organizations are not eligible to apply. Religious organizations that are designated to promote religious or sectarian activities or to encourage the preference of a particular religion are not eligible to apply. Now I'll hand it back to Lindsay to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Julissa. And I understand from the chat that some are having some issues with the audio. I apologize. We will have this presentation recorded, and hopefully in the recording, everything will come through clearly. So I'm sure those slides about eligibility are prompting a lot of questions. Reminder to please type any of those questions into the question box, and we are going to be addressing them at the end of this presentation. So grant award amounts are going to be determined by an organization's 2019 gross revenues. So for example, if your organization had revenue that was under $250,000, the max award is going to be $20,000. So that's actually a huge majority of nonprofits in our community. So that means you can apply for any amount up to $20,000. You don't have to ask for the full amount. You're going to ask for an amount up to $20,000. And then there is a sliding scale with the max award being $47,500. Organizations with gross revenues over $1 million are eligible to apply for this max award. In case it's helpful, when we say gross revenue, we mean the total amount of income your organization earned in calendar year 2019. That's the amount of funds in the door before any expenses were paid. There are some very clear buckets of funds as defined by the CARES Act about how these funds can be used. Luckily, the Miami-Dade Nonprofit Support Program is happy to cover both reimbursements as well as your future projected expenses. Expenses had to have been incurred between March 1st, 2020 and December 30th, 2020, not December 31st, December 30th. And again, you can apply for both reimbursements and future expenses. It does not have to be one or the other. Reimbursement expenses would be for the period between March 1st through August 31st. Future expenses are going to be for September 1st through December 30th. And as you can see in the program guidelines, there are very clear examples of the documentation that is needed to support the expenses you are seeking funding to cover. The first bucket of valid expenses is for business interruption costs. It's considered to cover general operating expenses related to closures due to COVID-19. And so examples of those expenses might include staff expenses, facilities overhead, which might be utilities, security, insurance, or maintenance. Rent or mortgage payments are acceptable, as well as paid expenses for programs and events that did not occur, such as a non-refundable deposit. The second bucket of valid expenses is for reopening costs. And by this, we mean expenses that are incurred directly in response to COVID-19 related to reopening the doors to your facilities and offering public activities. And some of those examples might be any staff costs related to the costs of actually trying to reopen your facility, COVID-19 training for staff, as well as health testing for staff, contracting with people to come in and help manage the reopening process. So that might be a professional cleaning company or security to help with pandemic rules reinforcement. Communications and marketing efforts related to addressing COVID-19 compliance requirements. The purchase of materials, including personal protective equipment or PPE, disinfecting supplies, hand sanitizer, sign production, asking your clients to remain at certain distances, and then any other physical accommodations that you might have had to purchase as you were planning for your reopening. So that might be construction costs to redesign your space or to put in place barriers in between desks or different spaces within your offices, or special things for the bathroom that are touchless to avoid any additional points of contact. The third and final area of valid expenses is for program transition support. And so this would be funding to help support your organization's efforts to provide virtual online programming. And so some examples might be salaries, and that includes for W-2 employees as well as 1099 independent contractors for the purposes of transitioning to a virtual platform. The equipment, systems, and devices related to facilitate that move to virtual programming. So that might be the computers and the tablets that you had to purchase, as well as video cameras. And also, this program transition costs could be related to your broadband capability. So increasing the speed for your broadband, or for the cost of software apps like Zoom or GoToMeeting, as well as the monthly charges for those streaming services. So again, we know that these types of costs may not cover all of the expenses that your organization incurred related to COVID-19, but these eligible costs come down from the federal government, and it's part of the CARES Act. These were not rules made up by the Miami Foundation or Miami-Dade County. The next piece is really super important for everyone to understand. Grant funding that you receive through this program can be used for expenses that have not already been covered. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Anything you get from this program, if you already got funding to support that expense, you cannot ask for funding from this program to cover that expense again. So for example, if you got a Children's Trust grant to help your organization support your transition to an online platform back in April, and that covered your related expenses up through August, you cannot apply to this program and ask for coverage for that expense for that exact same period of time of April through August. Similarly, you cannot apply to this program for revenue replacement or revenue losses due to the cancellation of programs, fundraisers, or venue closures. What do we mean by that? Okay, so you canceled your big gala in April and you lost your deposit on the venue. You're allowed to come to us and ask to be reimbursed for that non-refundable deposit on the venue cost. But what you can't come to us and ask is you can't apply to receive money that you expected to raise that night. So for example, the silent auction that never happened, you cannot apply to the fund and ask for funding to replace the lost revenue from not being able to host that silent auction. Similarly, you cannot apply to this program and say, well, we didn't have ticket sales because the event was canceled. That was lost revenue that you cannot apply to this program for. You can also not apply to this program for expenses that were already covered by insurance. Also built into the rules is that you cannot request funds to cover ongoing programming costs for maintaining the online platform or infrastructure work related to your broadband services. So for example, you can't apply for costs for the rewiring of your building to provide those kinds of services. But what you can apply for is the costs of, say, the Zoom platform, the monthly programming fees for that. For March through December, you can apply to this program to cover those expenses. But you cannot apply for other costs related to your virtual programming to cover the costs of actually doing the programming virtually. You'll see here on this next slide a sample of the request budget. This is built in and is part of the program materials. And then you'll also see when you actually go into the submittable platform to submit your application that this budget is built in as part of the application. There is going to be no Excel for you to actually fill this out in and upload. You are going to be putting your responses directly in the submittable platform using this format. And again, in the program guidelines, you can actually see what is here. And so as part of this budget, you're going to be asked to detail very specifically what it is you're seeking funds for. So those are the three main eligible categories of expenses: the business interruption expenses, the reopening costs, as well as the program transition costs. And then you're going to tell us, are you seeking a reimbursement? So something that you already paid for from March through August, or are you seeking for future expected expenses for September through December? Here's the list of required attachments. And so when you are completing your application, these are the things that we are going to ask you to upload as part of your application. And we recommend that you begin preparing and have these items ready to go when you're actually ready to complete your application. The first thing is we need the proof of your corporate status and legal address showing that you are based in Miami-Dade County. And you can get that from the State of Florida Division of Corporations website at dos.myflorida.com/sunbiz. This information, again, exactly where you need to go to download this information is built into the program guidelines. We're also going to ask for your balance sheet and income statement for calendar year 2019. If you're a 501c3 organization, which is part of the eligibility criteria, we are going to ask for your determination letter. If you are using a fiscal sponsor, we're going to need the IRS 501c3 determination letter for your fiscal sponsor. If you're a church, we are not going to expect you to upload anything into this field, but we will look throughout the application for other spaces where you can prove your status that you are a church. If, as part of your program budget, you are asking for reimbursement requests, we need you to provide backup documentation that clearly substantiates the purpose of the reimbursement request, what it is you spent money for. We need to see on there the amount, the date of the purchase, and the proof of payment, either the canceled check or from your bank statement showing that a purchase was made. It is not sufficient to just build into the program budget that you're seeking a reimbursement request. We need the actual backup documentation to be able to approve that request. Similarly, for future expected expenses, we're going to look for some sort of validation to the extent that it's possible to to give evidence of, okay, you expect that you're going to need support for your rent. Well, tell us what your average rent cost has been in the past so that we know how much we would feel comfortable paying for your future rent costs. Similarly, same goes for staff. If you're looking for staff support through the end of this year, we're going to need to see past staff expenses so that we can understand what is reasonable ask going forward through the end of this year. And we're going to need, as part of the application, we are collecting your payment information. So we're going to need you to upload your IRS 2020 W-9 as well as a void check or bank letter. If you are applying with a fiscal sponsor, we're going to need a copy of your fiscal sponsorship agreement or MOU. As part of the application, you will notice that you're also agreeing to the terms of the grant agreement. It's a way that we can actually try to expedite things so that hopefully as soon as we approve your grant application, we can get you funds as soon as possible. So that's why we built everything in. We're collecting your payment information up front. We're collecting the grant agreement up front. We are trying to streamline things and get you money as soon as possible. You'll see built into the application, there is reporting requirements so that if you do receive a grant, all grantees are going to be required to submit a final report to the foundation by February 12th, 2021 to substantiate the use of grant funds. This final report date is non-negotiable. Typically, the Miami Foundation, for any of you who've worked with us in the past, know that we really do try to be flexible when it comes to reporting deadlines. But unfortunately for this program, there is going to be no flexibility. We have to report back to the county, who has to report back to the federal government on the use of these funds. And so grantees who do not report back to us and substantiate how the funds were used risk us needing to claw back that funding, and that is not something that we want to do. Okay, we just shared a lot of information with you, and we know that the questions are coming into the chat box. Please continue to submit your specific questions in the chat box. But we're going to dive into what are the questions we've been getting, since launching the program earlier this week, some of the more frequently asked questions. We're going to try to address those here before diving into your specific questions. Julissa, would you mind helping me walk through these questions?
Sure. So the first one is, can individuals apply?
No. This program is designed for 501c3 nonprofits, churches, or equivalent. So equivalence means using a fiscal sponsor.
Okay. Can I apply using a fiscal sponsor?
So yes, we are allowing applicants to apply using a fiscal sponsor, and as you'll see in the guidelines, our answer to this question is you need to be able to show that you have an established relationship with that fiscal sponsor, an agreement that was signed before this pandemic began, that this is not a fiscal sponsor who is just supporting you now to receive this grant, but that you had a pre-existing relationship with a 501c3 fiscal sponsor.
Are these loans or grants?
These are going to be grants, and so we actually made a very big push when we found out about this program. There was the option that this could have been loans, this could have been grants. We pushed hard to get these to be grants for nonprofit organizations. We knew that it would ensure that more organizations would have access to these dollars by making them grants. So they do not need to be paid back, but they do need to be validated. So any money that you receive as part of that final report, there will be some validation that you need to show us exactly how the grant funds were used and prove that they were used for the approved eligible uses of funds.
What is the grant period?
The grant period, so all funds have to be used by December 30th, 2020. And as we said, then the next question I know is, when will the report be required? All the money has to be spent by December 30th, and then a report is going to be required by February 12th, 2021. Okay, I think there's some more.
Can I request both reimbursement and future expenses?
Yes, and so we will very clearly ask you in the application, are you seeking reimbursement? Are you seeking future expenses? Are you seeking both? You are allowed to ask for both, but you will need documentation to validate your requests.
What kind of documentation is needed for reimbursement?
So we are going to need to see backup documentation. So that might be dated invoices or receipts. That might be signed contracts. It might be a bank statement showing that payment was made. It might be employee timesheets or payroll documents. It might be utility bills, email confirmations that supplies that you ordered were received. As much documentation that you can provide that will clearly show us that the things you were paying for are related to the eligible uses of funds and that they were received and paid for by your organization, that is the documentation that we're going to need to be able to approve a reimbursement request. You cannot just ask for money and not provide any backup documentation. There is an upload field for you to upload that documentation.
Can I apply for revenue losses due to COVID-19?
No, you cannot apply for revenue losses due to COVID-19. So that's similar to the example I gave earlier in the presentation where I gave the example of you had a gala that got canceled. You cannot apply for the loss to your organization of the ticket sales, unfortunately. You can apply for funding to help you with venue costs for a non-refundable deposit or other expenses that were paid for that were non-refundable, but you cannot apply for revenue losses.
Okay. I got a PPP loan or I applied for a Department of Cultural Affairs mass program. Can I still apply to this program?
So the answer is yes. So you'll see very clearly we have eligibility criteria and then we have priority criteria. So if you meet all of the eligibility criteria, you can apply to this program. But there is priority criteria. It is very important that we prioritize organizations who have not received any other sort of federal funding related to COVID-19. And so when we are reviewing applications, we are going to first be reviewing and awarding grants to organizations who have not received any other sort of government funding related to COVID-19. After those grants have been reviewed and awards have been made, we will then consider organizations that do not meet the priority criteria, which include organizations who might have received a PPP loan or might have applied for and received a Department of Cultural Affairs grant.
Our programming has moved virtual. Can I apply for funds to support virtual programming?
So that's a tricky question, and as you'll see in the guidelines, the answer is like yes and no. You can apply for the cost of the virtual platform, so for the Zoom or the GoToMeeting costs, but you can apply for the cost to actually the staff you had to hire to maybe redesign your materials to make it available for virtual. But what you can't do is apply for the cost of supporting the ongoing virtual programming. And so we really try to spell this out very clearly throughout the guidelines and in the frequently asked questions.
How will applications be reviewed?
So as we mentioned, we are going to be reviewing applications on a rolling basis. And first, we will be considering organizations who meet all of the eligibility criteria and also are considered priority organizations, meaning that they have revenues of $3 million or less in 2019, and they have not received any other government funding. We have a full team at the foundation that will be reviewing and approving applications, and we will be sending out notifications of grant awards in early October after the grant application window has closed.
When will I be notified whether we are receiving a grant?
So some folks that are applying now, if they're clearly not eligible, meaning they're not a 501c3, but they still submit an application or they don't meet the eligibility criteria, are going to receive declines on a rolling basis. We don't want to get anyone's hopes up thinking that they are going to receive funds. But for organizations that meet all the eligibility criteria, the team is going to be starting next week to review applications, and notifications will start going out in October, and that will continue through early November as we dig through the many hundreds of applications we're going to receive. Organizations that meet all of the priority criteria will be notified first before organizations who do not meet the priority criteria.
I have more questions. How can I get more help?
We are here to help you. These are the links here where you can find the program guidelines. There's an email address where you can contact us to get support during business hours. We are typically getting back to people within an hour, and if your question can't easily be answered via an email, we are happy to then get on the phone with you and help provide that one-on-one support, or if the person who got the email couldn't answer the question, we're going to follow up and make sure you get the answer that you need. Additionally, we have a link from the website, Calendly, where you can sign up for one-on-one office hours with somebody from the team. And here's the link to the submittable application so you can actually apply. We do recommend you read the program guidelines cover to cover, read the frequently asked questions, review the application questions before you actually dive in and try to submit your application. Here's the team that is set up, the Programs and Grants Administration team at the Miami Foundation, that are here to help you. These are the people behind the screen that are responding to your emails, that are going to be talking to you on office hours, and then eventually this is the team that's going to be helping me to dive in and actually review your grant applications and process the grant awards. Apply by September 30th. That is the deadline for this program. We know that this is not a long application window, and we apologize for that. We really do. But we want to ensure that we can get the money out to your organizations by the deadline set by the federal government, and that's why we needed to have this short application window. We tried to design the application in a way that would not make it too difficult. And again, we ask for your patience as we navigate this program with you. We created this program in a span of just a few short weeks, and we know that there are a lot of questions out there, and we're going to be here holding your hand, helping you as you figure out whether you're eligible to apply and as you work on your application. Thank you. That was a lot of information. I know that a ton of questions have come into the questions inbox. I'm going to bring in Nikki Zarkin from Radical Partners, who is going to help us to dive into the questions that have come into the chat.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yes, there are plenty of questions that have come in, and I'm trying to consolidate them. So the first question is, I think you said this, but just to recap it, is if someone is physically located, their office is not located in Miami-Dade, but they provide services in Miami-Dade, are they still eligible?
So we know that that is a common question that we're getting, and we did build into the guidelines a caveat. So this program is primarily to support organizations that are based in and providing services in Miami-Dade. We do welcome organizations that are based outside of Miami-Dade that are providing a significant amount of services in Miami-Dade to apply, and we will be reviewing your applications on a case-by-case basis. As part of your application, whatever you can do to show us the number of staff specifically dedicated to supporting services that are provided in Miami-Dade County, budgets that are specific to your work in Miami-Dade County, that is what's going to be necessary to help make the case that your organization is deserving of support from this program. So it's not a guarantee, but if you think your organization kind of falls into that bucket of significant services in Miami-Dade County, we're happy to kind of consider an application from your organization.
Thank you, Lindsay. Could you reiterate for folks the cap of employees on eligibility?
Yes, so we breezed through this, but when the program was set up, it was the intention that it supports small nonprofits, and this was defined for the purposes of this program as 25 or fewer full-time employees as of March 1st. So it's not what you had on March 15th. On March 1st, how many full-time employees you had, that's the number you are going to report as part of the application, and that is what we are going to use when we are considering whether your organization is eligible for funding.
Wonderful. There are quite a few questions for clarifications around the recipients of previous funding. So I think specifically is, can you apply if you've received SBA funding as well as PPP funding? And then there's a follow-up question about the MAS grants as well.
Yeah. So yes, SBA funding is considered government funding. So yes, if you fit all of the eligibility criteria, you can apply, but you will not be considered priority. Your application will be considered and reviewed for potential funding after we have given out funds to all of the organizations who have not received any type of support. And as I noted in the presentation, surveys that were done by FIU have told us that over 60% of our local nonprofit community has received no form of support. And so the intention with this pool of $10 million was to ensure that they got support first. And then we know that organizations did not get the full amount of funding that they needed to cover expenses they have incurred related to COVID-19 pandemic. And so we hope that with any remaining dollars, we are able to support the organizations who may have received some support, but it didn't completely cover their expenses.
Great. There's another question kind of tied into this, which is, could you clarify the cap on the 2019 gross revenues for eligibility as well?
Yep. And so when we are considering a grant award to your organization, we're going to be looking at your 2019 gross revenues, and that will tell you which bucket you fall into in terms of potential funding. And so just to reiterate, if you had gross revenues of $20,000 or less, the maximum amount you can seek through this program is $20,000. If you fell in the category of gross revenues between $250,000 and $499,000, you can ask for up to $30,000. If you're in the category of $500,000 to $999,000, you could ask for up to $40,000 from this fund. And if your organization budget is over $1 million, you can ask for the max award of up to $47,500. There is the caveat that if your organization's gross revenues in 2019 were over $3 million, you can still apply, assuming you meet the eligibility criteria, but you will not be prioritized because we really, again, this program is intended to support small nonprofits.
Thanks, Lindsay. There are quite a few folks also asking for further clarification around the MAS grants from the Department of Cultural Affairs. Not only eligibility, but if you have not yet received an award, should they still apply or should they revoke their applications?
Yep. And I know there is confusion. We released this program on Tuesday, and then we subsequently this week have released an updated set of guidelines, which is available on our website. There will be a notice that is going out on Monday. I know Julissa addressed it as part of her presentation. So originally when we released the guidelines, based on some initial direction that we had, because the arts community had a $10 million pool of funds available, we had initially said they need to apply to the Department of Cultural Affairs. Deeper understanding of like what funds would actually be available to organizations has allowed us to open up the pool of funds to arts and cultural institutions. So they can apply to us, even if they are applying to the Miami Arts Support Grant Program from the Department of Cultural Affairs. But if they do get a grant from the Department of Cultural Affairs, or they already got one prior to this program, they would be considered not priority. So we consider an application, but they would not be in the priority category. It is up to an individual organization to determine whether they, in order to be considered priority, would want to withdraw their application from the Department of Cultural Affairs program. We know that that's a tough decision. There is no guarantee to receive funding from either program, but we are doing our best, very much in partnership with the Department of Cultural Affairs, to figure out how to get the organizations as much money as possible so that they can recover from the expenses that they've had related to COVID-19. So we want to help organizations. We will work with you. We will talk to you to figure out what makes sense. We know that there are some organizations where they maybe aren't primarily an arts and cultural organization, but because they did some arts programming, they applied through the Department of Cultural Affairs, but they only may be eligible to, say, get $5,000. And if they applied through our program, they may be able to get $20,000. Your organization has to make that determination for yourself as to whether you're going to withdraw. Again, though, if you got a PPP loan or you got an SBA loan or some other government funding, that already bumps you to the non-priority criteria. So it's really important that you fully understand like what would make your organization eligible for this program, and also what it is that would put you to be considered priority as part of this program. I hope that helps. I know it's not perfectly clear, and we are doing our best to, in this new version of the guidelines that we did release that's on our website, to make that as clear as possible about what the options are for organizations.
Great. A couple of people asked if they do not operate on a calendar year for their fiscal year, how should they show their finances?
So we don't want you to have to redo all of your financials that you're uploading as part of when we ask for your balance sheet and income statement. But is best possible, because so we can compare apples to apples, we are going to be comparing organizations' financials for calendar year. So when we ask in the question, what was your 2019 gross revenues, we do need that for the calendar year. When you're uploading your financials, we understand that might be difficult to redo them in a format to show calendar year, but as best possible, we do need for the answer to the question for the calendar year gross revenues, we do need that number.
Great. There's a question here that says, please clarify church applicants. Under eligibility, it lists churches. Under ineligible applicants, it states limitation on religious organizations. Would you please clarify?
Yeah, and we know that can be tricky. So according to the IRS, churches are eligible and considered nonprofit organizations, and they don't need the IRS determination letter and status to receive tax-deductible donations. They are considered as part of this program, but they can only apply for funding for COVID-19 related expenses for programming that was available to the whole community and not just to a small subset of membership, say. So if there's a church who has been helping to feed the neighboring community during this pandemic, that is a program that is an expense that they can apply to us for. But they would not be able to cover expenses related to paying staff at the church that were running religious programs for the church. And I hope that helps. I know it's not perfectly clear, but in the guidelines, we really do dive into it a little bit in the FAQs. So hopefully that helps.
Great. A few folks are also asking, do you include in-kind donations and volunteer hours when calculating your gross revenue?
No, it has to be cash in the door.
Got it. And then I'm sorry, there are a lot of different requests on a personal basis, so I'm going to try and fold them into one question. But if you could reiterate again what the expenses and reimbursements that are eligible, right? Is rent covered or taxes covered? And then also kind of the date to which projected expenses can be reimbursed or can be projected towards.
Yep. So we have reimbursements and we have future projected expenses. So reimbursements would be any expense that you incurred between March 1st of 2020 and August 31st of 2020, where you have sufficient backup that you can show it falls in one of kind of the three categories of expenses that are approved as part of this grant program. And you have, again, the backup materials to show evidence of that. Future projected expenses are going to be from September 1st through December 30th, 2020. And so, yes, it's pretty clear in our program guidelines, like one of the valid areas of expenses is business interruption costs. And we allow as part of that expenses related to helping to support paying your staff, facilities overhead, which might be, utilities, your security payments, your insurance, or any other maintenance costs. Your rent and mortgage payments are included in this. I hope that helps, and we really try to be very clear in spelling out in the guidelines and in the application really specifically what things are and are not covered. And these, again, were not expenses chosen by us. These are part of the CARES Act rules about what things can and cannot be covered using this pool of grant funds.
Great. We have on this point another question, which is the grant deadline is September 30th. Can organizations submit evidence of salaries paid up to and including September 15th?
We would prefer that for consistency purposes, when we're talking about reimbursements, that it's everything from March 1st through August 31st. And then everything else is considered a future projected expense. And so under future projected expenses, I know we're already midway into September, but please include any of your September related costs under the future expected expenses, and then include the backup. So any documentation you have of, payments that you've made already for September, you can include there. We have a space for you to upload that documentation, but for comparison purposes and how we're thinking about this program, future is considered everything from September 1st
on. And then following up on this again is some folks are asking, what are the financial documents or proof that is necessary for these expenses?
Yep. So there's a lot of options. We actually have question number 14 in the frequently asked questions of our program guidelines actually give a lot of really good detailed examples of what you can include as backup documentation. So some samples might be dated invoices and receipts, contracts. So if you have a contract related to your rent, or you have a contract with a vendor for something, you'd want to upload the contract and then, proof of the payment to that vendor. Employee timesheets or some evidence of ACH payments or contracts with contracted employees. If you're asking for reimbursement related to your utilities, send us a copy of your utility bill from, say, April. Email confirmations of any specific goods being delivered, specific services rendered. Anything that you have in writing related to an expense that you can share with us will help us make it easier to get you the funds to reimburse you for that expense. But reminder, we can't reimburse you for anything you've already received money for. So if insurance helped you cover something, don't apply it to us for that expense. If another grant funder, whether it be government or not, gave you a grant to cover an expense, don't apply to us for that same expense. Okay, when you're submitting the application, you are certifying that you are not applying to this program for any expense that has already been covered. It cannot be duplicative. We cannot give out any grants to cover anything that you have already received funding for. So by certifying that and submitting the application, you are agreeing that you did not submit anything that has already been paid for.
Great. Someone is asking, do you need executed contracts and job descriptions for full-time staff?
I don't know if you think it's appropriate, and it might be a case-by-case basis. So if you think that will help make the case, I don't think we are asking for job descriptions for the staff. There is an element of trust as part of the application. And so if you are showing us evidence of your payrolls and that you paid somebody that's on your staff, we are trusting you that they are on your staff and that the expenses are valid and kind of fall within the guidelines as stated. So we have not stated that we need job descriptions. If there's a contract, especially with an outside vendor, I think that is helpful to show what is the rate that was approved for that person and how many hours you're asking for reimbursement for or for future expenses for.
Great. A couple of folks are asking if they're a registered nonprofit, but they're a vendor to the Miami-Dade County Public School System, are they still eligible?
Yes, as long as you're not designated as a school or a school support organization like a PTO or booster club, you are eligible. We know that the schools and other educational organizations have been hit by this pandemic. And we want to support you the best way possible, but schools, unfortunately, and those other school support organizations are not eligible. But if you're an after-school provider and you're doing tutoring for students after school, you're not a school. You're a nonprofit that's doing educational services, and you are eligible to apply. Schools are going to have their own buckets of funding from the federal government. We unfortunately don't have information about that or know when those kinds of funds are going to be released or by who, but we do know that schools are not able to apply to this program.
And then for future expected expenses, is that only until December 31st?
It's actually only until December 30th. The way the CARES Act was written, future expected expenses are through December 30th. And yes, it cannot be, you cannot ask us for funding to prepay your rent for 2021 or for any expenses that will go into 2021. It needs to be expenses that will be incurred before the end of the year, or specifically December 30th.
Mm-hmm. Great. There's a question here. If we received an SBA loan that needs to be paid back, do the expenses need to be over and above the loan amount?
The expenses have to be over and above the loan amount or for different expenses. So if your SBA loan only covered your staffing costs, you can come to us and seek your rent or mortgage costs or some other costs. But yes, exactly, we cannot duplicate money that you have already received.
Is there a percentage of total compensation that is appropriate for this grant? Can you apply for 100% of a person's salary?
Yes, there is no rules that say you can't apply for 100% of a person's salary. It's very clear that this, in terms of eligible expenses, that we are encouraging organization. That's a business interruption cost. We know that COVID-19 and having to shut your doors and not be able to kind of earn many of your expected sources of revenue have impacted your organization. And so, yes, you can apply for salaries related to the people on your team because we know your organization has been able to bring less into the door. So in order to keep those people on staff, you can apply for up to 100% of a person's salary for this program.
Great. I know we touched on this a little bit before, but just to clarify, because some questions are still coming in, can hardware and PPP be covered by this grant?
Yes, hardware, so that would be considered a program transition support. So if you needed laptops for your staff so that they could work remotely and do remote services for your student, for the children that you're serving, or if you needed to buy iPads, that is considered a valid expense, and that's program transition support. Similarly, PPE, so if you needed to buy masks for your staff or dividers between the desks or cleaning equipment, all of that is considered under mitigation expenses for reopening.
If salaried staff were on reduced pay due to COVID and received back pay in September, is that covered?
Yes, if you can show the valid kind of backup showing that they were paid, the foundation through this program is happy to reimburse you for those costs.
And then a couple of folks are asking for an explanation why daycares cannot apply for the program.
These were, when the program was designed, the intention was to support nonprofit 501c3s. And so we know that there were other buckets of funds that were going to hopefully be coming down from the federal government through Miami-Dade County as it related to schools and daycares and preschools. And so this bucket of funds was not designated to support those types of organizations. We know that those entities were incredibly hard hit, and unfortunately this program is not going to be the avenue in which they can receive funding.
And then as a follow-up to that, a lot of folks are asking if we have any further information about school funding that may become available in the future.
I don't have that information now, but we can definitely check in with Miami-Dade County Public School System to see if they have any information about that or if the county has any additional information. We've been so focused on and excited about the release of this $10 million and making it available for nonprofits that we have just been really focused on getting this program launched so that we can get the money in the hands of organizations as quickly as possible.
Great. If you apply for any sort of money, this specific person is asking about an SBA loan that gets approved after grant money comes in from the foundation. What happens then?
So you would just need to ensure that whatever money, if you get the grant from us, then you receive another grant, that you don't report back to us that it was used for the same purposes in which you received that other grant or that other loan. And so that may require a follow-up conversation to say either A, you need to return money because now you've received too much support and it's more than you actually needed in terms of your past expenses as well as your future expenses, or you need to clarify with the other funder or with us that I asked for it for this, but here's another valid expense that this other funding isn't going to cover that falls within your guidelines that we need it to cover this. And so that would require a conversation for you to work with us to ensure, again, that there is no duplication of us covering expenses.
Gotcha. And then some folks are asking, is there a way to get a better result on the grant? Are you more likely to earn a grant if you're applying for salaries versus rent, and how will decisions be made?
No, we're not going to be looking within the categories. We're agnostic when you're filling out the program budget, what it is you're applying for. They are all considered to be valid and important expenses that we want to get our organizations help for. What will be easier is the better documentation you provide, the more clear it is, the easier it will be to get you as much of your ask as possible. So if we can validate that you said you had this expense and you provided clear documentation, it's going to be easier for us to approve that whole amount. If we have to go back to you and reopen up your application for editing and ask for additional documentation and can't get the information that we need to feel secure in awarding your organization a grant, then you might not get your full ask.
If someone applied for reimbursement of, say, rent through the MAS grant, can you then apply for reimbursement for other operational expenses not under the MAS grant, such as utilities, internet, et cetera?
Absolutely. Again, it's just about ensuring that we don't duplicate an expense. So if the MAS grant is going to cover rent, great. Ensure that when you're applying to us, that you're not asking for rent costs for the same duration of time. If the MAS grant was only going to cover for, September and October, and then you're applying to us for November and December, that's totally acceptable. It just can't be for the same expense during the same time.
So this question that just came in is reminding me of one that I also have in my backlog, which is, do you count your employees if you're a statewide organization that are in the entire state or just in Miami-Dade County?
No, we want to know about Miami-Dade. So who are the number of employees, full-time employees that are supporting Miami-Dade programs and services? And again, for any of those organizations that are based outside of Miami-Dade County, this program is primarily designed for organizations that are based here. And while we're going to consider your application, we will likely be following up with you with some really specific questions to understand what staff you have on the ground here, how many full-time FTE are dedicated to 100% programs and services here in Miami-Dade County. We're going to be following up with lots of detailed questions with you to make sure that we would feel comfortable actually awarding a grant to an organization that is not based here in Miami-Dade.
Gotcha. Sorry, I'm still scrolling through these, more and more coming in. So some folks are asking, is this competitive or is it strictly eligibility based?
So in the first wave, it is strictly eligibility based. And so when we are awarding grants at the beginning, we've determined your eligibility and you're not part of the priority criteria. It's not competitive. We're not comparing application, if we've determined that you have all the backup documentation, we are going to make sure that we can get your organization a grant. And so it's not going to be competitive. Once we get past the non-priority criteria, it's not that it's competition based, but we are going to then be looking at, all right, how many valid applications that meet all of the eligibility criteria, asked for funding, how much did they ask for, what band did they fall into, and how much funding do we have left? Now that we've given grants to all of the folks who meet the priority criteria, how much is left and how many organizations have had their applications fully vetted and we've said we've approved X amount? And then there will likely be some portion of the grant that folks receive based on how much funding is available. So there's not unlike a typical grant application from a foundation where we're asking folks, to pick and choose between funding this program or funding that program, this is not that. Once we have kind of designated that you meet the eligibility and that you have had valid expenses or valid future expenses and there's an amount approved, we want to try to get you that funding. It's just going to be based on how much we actually still have available.
Great. There's a question here. Will there be program support available in Spanish? And then how about in Creole?
So we don't, again, in moving so quickly to get this program live in a few short weeks, we do not have the materials fully translated into Spanish or Creole at this point. But the foundation is committed to try and get you whatever help we can in terms of helping you understand the materials and get them translated to you. It might be verbally, setting up special separate office hours in another language for you. We will work with you. And so we do ask that you send an email to support@miamifoundation.org. If you need to send that in Spanish or in Creole, we will get somebody to translate and then we will get somebody on the phone with you. Julissa, can you also just do me a favor and translate that answer for me so that whoever asked that question can hear it in Spanish as well?
Sure. So, la información que estamos dando hoy no está completa en español, no está traducida completa en español, aún está en inglés, pero de necesitar ayuda en alguna duda o necesitas ayuda en alguna clarificación, pues estamos aquí para ayudarte. Puedes enviar un correo electrónico a support miamifoundation.org y nosotros nos vamos a contactar con usted y podemos contestar cualquier tipo de pregunta, pero ahora mismo esta información pues no está en español, pero con mucho gusto pues también puede entrar a Calendly, que está, el enlace está en la presentación ahí, y puede pedir una reunión con cualquier miembro del equipo y nosotros nos ponemos en contacto con usted y le explicamos cualquier duda.
Thank you, Julissa. I appreciate that. And we know that the office hours have been going quickly. I think in the first 2 days since launching the program, almost all of the slots got filled. And so we are working on adding additional office hours, and also send an email to support. As I mentioned, we are getting responses back to people for the most part, if it's during business hours, within an hour. So we will try to answer your question really quickly via email. And if your question does require a phone call, our team will hop on a call with you and get you the answers that you need in the language that you need it.
Great. Lindsay, I see the time. I just want to make sure that we have time for a couple more questions.
Yep, I'm happy to stay on to answer a few more questions.
Great. There are a few folks who are asking, does this grant cover salary expenses only for full-time employees, or does it include consultants or part-time folks and independent contractors?
It covers both, and so hopefully it is clear in the guidelines that we are happy to expect costs for both full-time employees as well as 1099 contractors or part-time employees.
Great. And Julissa, several folks are saying gracias for your response, so gracias. And then several folks are also asking, can we apply if we have received other types of grants from the Miami Foundation?
Yes. You can apply if you received other grants. The only thing when we're talking about the priority criteria, we're talking about government grants. And so that might be an SBA loan, that might be a PPP loan, that might be a Children's Trust grant, that might be a Department of Cultural Affairs grant. If it came from a government entity, that is considered a government grant or loan, and that would put you in the not priority criteria. But if you received some level of funding from the Miami Foundation, you are eligible to apply to this program and still be considered in the priority criteria, assuming you meet the other priority criteria factors.
Great. And then I'm also going to do another folding together of a couple of folks' questions. So I'm sorry, I hope it captures everyone's. But several folks are asking if they can apply for funding to restart programs that they had to put off due to COVID.
Yes, that would be acceptable for, are we talking about for future, I assume that's for future expected expenses, although maybe for expenses, but yes, because I assume a lot of those costs are going to be either the cost of transitioning that to a virtual program, and so there's a number of costs that will be covered there, but then because this pool of funding is available to cover staff-related costs, then that is an acceptable expense because it was related to COVID-19. So yes.
Great. And our final question is, will this presentation materials be provided via email or online anywhere?
Yes, so hopefully you can see on the screen miamifoundation.org/COVID-19 relief grants. We have this version of the program guidelines there. We have our contact information there. We have the link for office hours at that website. And anytime we have an update related to the program guidelines, that is going to,
I think Lindsay froze on. It will be available on the grant website.
Can you hear me again? Okay, good. So yes, that information is going to be available on our website. That's where you're going to get the latest about the program, download the most recent version of the guidelines, and this recorded webinar is going to be available for download probably starting on Monday. If you need additional help, we're actually having a second webinar on Tuesday. So if you don't feel like you got your questions answered and you want to listen in again just to make sure you really got it, feel free to tune in on Tuesday. But thank you. We appreciate everything you have been doing for Miami, for the community, serving on the front lines. We want to get you the help we can. We know your organizations have been hit incredibly hard, and so we appreciate your patience with us because we rolled this out really quickly. And so there may be changes we have to make to the guidelines. We may not have all the answers when you first ask it. We're going to get you those answers. We're going to make sure you're informed, and we're going to make sure you have the help that you need to apply to this program and hopefully be successful in your application. So thank you. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and we hope you have a great rest of your Friday and a terrific weekend. Thank you, Julissa. Thank you, Nikki, for being part of this with me. We appreciate you.
Take care. Bye,
All
everyone.
right, bye.
Bye.
Oh, Willie. Bye, Bella.
Okay.
Sí.
I'm trying to close the how do I end? End webinar.